From the moment Inside Out 2 was announced, I didn't think it was a good sign for Pixar. Because not only did I think that Inside Out was one film that definitely didn't need a sequel and had tied up everything very nicely, but keep in mind this was also at a time when Pixar seemed to be losing its touch and being forced to go more and more corporate by Disney. In other words, it appeared that making an unnecessary sequel to Inside Out was a lot more safe than taking a risk on something new like the company had been doing since day one. So, for me at least, this sequel's very existence raised a lot of red flags. And then the movie actually came out and did absolutely bonkers at the box office. And today, I'd like to go over why I believe it was both a good and bad thing that Inside Out 2 did as well as it did. And obviously this is going to be one of my more opinion-based videos, so if you prefer when I stay objective, this might not be the video for you. And there are also going to be major spoilers ahead for both the original Inside Out and Inside Out 2. So in case you aren't entirely caught up and don't want to know what happens, please come back to this video after you have seen it. This will be your one and only warning. Okay, so to be perfectly frank, a big reason I didn't think Inside Out needed a sequel is because the first one didn't really make a connection with me. And I know that might sound sacrilegious, but I just simply felt that while it was fine, it couldn't stand up among Pixar's best. But even aside from my personal opinion of the first movie, there was also the fact that I felt there wasn't really anywhere to take the story. I mean, the emotions helped Riley get through a tough stretch in her life, and Joy learned a lesson about the importance of sadness. How many times can you repeat a story like that? Frankly, if you were to have asked me before anything about this sequel was announced what the best follow-up to Inside Out would have been, I would have said to focus on a completely different kid and see how their emotions interact and handle the problems in their life. But then the trailer dropped, and it became very apparent how Pixar was planning on continuing Riley's story without it feeling repetitive. Now, to address the elephant in the room first, I, like many others, were confused by the introduction of the new emotions, mainly because they hadn't appeared in the parents' heads in the first movie, and logic would only dictate that if growing up means having more emotions, then they should have been there already. And not to mention, most of the emotions introduced seem to be concepts that could easily be covered by the existing emotions, especially since the first movie ends showing that Riley is now capable of feeling a mixture of different emotions at once, which can easily cover things like anxiety, embarrassment, and the like. So to put it simply, for a variety of reasons, I didn't have much hope for this movie, especially considering Pixar's recent output hadn't really been up to their standards on top of everything else. But that being said, did Inside Out 2 manage to beat the odds and be a good movie in spite of all of that? And somewhat surprisingly, I'd actually have to say yes. The story is similar yet different, actually continues in an organic way, and most importantly, there's no character regression. Joy actually references the previous movie and tries to apply the lessons she learned to the situations she finds herself in. But at the same time, she also makes the same mistake all over again without realizing it, which unfortunately happens quite often in the real world. Just because people realize they're doing something wrong doesn't mean they can always apply that lesson outside of the context they learned it from. And I also felt it was particularly smart to pair her with anger, fear and disgust this time around, because not only is the audience already familiar with them, but I also think they had a better dynamic all around than just the stereotypical odd couple one Joy and Sadness had in the first film. Even things like the sarcasm or the brainstorm scene, that's pretty inventive and funny stuff. Basically, it's very evident that there was actual care, thought, and quality behind this. But perhaps most importantly, I do think this movie does a better job of showing Riley as her own person independent of her emotions. Now, I know a lot of people brought that up in reference to this movie, but I just want to be on record as saying that I signaled that out as a problem with the original Inside Out years ago in one of my first videos on this channel, the Pixar Problem Part 4, World Building. And if you don't believe me, I'll leave a link to the video in the description so you can see it for yourself. But the point is, Riley's lack of independence from her emotions is something I felt was a major issue with the first movie, and it is something that's addressed here. And only just some examples of that are the whole sense of self, which helps dictate Riley's actions even when her emotions aren't involved, the scene where she initially refuses to listen to anxiety to the point that she literally has to throw out her sense of self to persuade her to do what she wants, and actively calling Joy to the console at the end. And I will say, all of that does feel more realistic than what's shown in the first movie. They should have even done that last one in the original to help drive home the point that she actually needs sadness to be happy, rather than just looking like a puppet. But perhaps the best scene that demonstrates her independence is when Joy tells the others not to touch the console and just let Riley do her thing. That, I feel, more than anything else shows that Riley can function without the direct influence of her emotions, which, once again, is more true to life than the original, where it feels a lot more like an emotion must be in control at all times. And finally, there's anxiety. And I just want to say, somehow Pixar managed to make her work despite everything that was stacked against her inclusion. Though honestly, one of the smartest things they probably did was not try to address why the parents didn't have the new emotions, mid-credit scenes aside, and instead just focus on Riley specifically. Because even if that's not the best world-building wise, it does make the whole concept easier to swallow. But as for the character herself, what's particularly genius is that, unlike Joy in the first movie, where it's pretty evident right from the start that she's causing problems for Riley, at first it looks like anxiety is Riley's savior and the one who has everything figured out, with it only becoming evident over time that her running Riley unchecked is not a good thing. And ironically enough, embarrassment seems to be the first one to figure this out, maybe even before most of the audience. And that was another thing they did pretty well, because of the new emotions, you just get the feeling that he'd be the one most likely to question if what anxiety is doing is actually a good thing, but also be too shy to say anything and initially only extend it as far as not ratting out sadness. What I'm trying to say is, Pixar has a habit, especially in recent years, of not having a villain in their movies and instead have a sympathetic character unknowingly cause the movie's conflict, with the original Inside Out itself being a good example. Now, I've dedicated countless videos to explaining how most of the time this doesn't work and can easily cause narrative issues, but I will freely admit, anxiety is a great example of the concept done right. Because once again, At first, it looks like she knows exactly what she's doing and knows what's best for Riley, to the point that even the audience might start to wonder if she's right about everything. So as a result, it makes sense that, seemingly validated with every decision she makes and being unchallenged, she would end up taking things way too far and not realize it until it's too late. Because in actuality, nobody has all the answers, and believing you do will only result in a terrible fall, and that's exactly what happens to Anxiety, who ends up being forced to admit that she can't control Riley and allows the other emotions to keep her in check. So simply put, it's impossible not to understand where Anxiety's coming from and how things could get so out of hand without her realizing it. And before I continue, I'd just like to say that one scene that was particularly good was when Riley's trying to sleep and Anxiety has everybody start coming up with scenarios of everything that can go wrong so they can be prepared for it, which leads to her becoming incredibly stressed and unable to sleep. But then Joy encourages everybody to instead depict all the things that could go right, which, even if it does get quickly unrealistic, as discussed notes, calms Riley down and allows her to fall asleep. Because not only is that something everybody suffers from, being so afraid of things that might happen that they can't sleep until they start indulging in saccharine fantasies, but it also shows that Joy isn't wrong with her philosophy either. Because while the first movie shows the dangers of what's known as toxic positivity, this movie doesn't ignore that trying to be happy, even in a stressful situation, can be good and even needed. In other words, this scene shows that sometimes being too serious all the time is a bad thing, and that positivity and fun, even if it's unrealistic, can be the best medicine. And that's honestly something the entertainment industry needs to take more to heart these days. People are already too acquainted with the stresses of life, and watching something that's simply fun and stress-free, even if it's unrealistic, can go a long way in helping them. But to get back on topic, the point is that Inside Out 2 does actually work as a sequel to the original Inside Out, even with everything it had stacked against it. Really, this movie working as well as it did seemed about as unlikely as there being traditional animation in a Pixar movie. But hey, it happened. And just as a side note, not only was that pretty funny, but also clever on Anger's part at the end there. But all that being said, that doesn't mean it's perfect. Because for one thing, if there was one emotion the adults should have, it's envy. Even if she's depicted in a good light, jealousy is one of the most rampant negative emotions adults feel. So if anything, she should have been the one to make an appearance, not Anxiety. But even apart from that, the story does mirror the original a bit closely, but I didn't actually see that as too big of a deal, since the whole concept doesn't allow for much wiggle room without it quickly getting ridiculous, but it's still noteworthy. And finally, while the climax works within the narrative and is a good one when looking at it that way, I just don't know how suitable it is for kids. I mean, the original Inside Out was a lot more depressing, to the point that it only reinforced my belief that Pixar wasn't making their movies for kids anymore. But this? I just don't know. It's not nearly as sad, but it broaches subjects that children might not understand. It's not nearly as bad as something like Turning Red. Children can watch this, but I just don't know if it'll go over their heads, Or specifically when it comes to the climax, too stressful. Seriously, what is it with supposed children's movies realistically depicting panic attacks all of a sudden? What's so important about them that a child needs to see it? This is a movie, not a public service announcement. Did Pixar learn nothing from the aforementioned scene I discussed? To put it another way, if you're a frequent watcher of my channel, you'll know that a big concern of mine is how much children's movies actually consider children. And I just don't think this one does as much as it could have. I mean, considering the theme of a teenage girl going through the early stages of puberty and the stresses that come with it, should it have even tried to be suitable for children? Would it have been better off with a PG-13 rating and targeting a more adult audience? And once again, I must admit, I don't know. I just don't know. Because, like I already said, while the movie tastefully only focuses on the emotions themselves in regards to puberty and is appropriate for children to watch, unlike Turning Red, I'd argue, I just don't know if the overall themes and the concepts it tackles are too mature for children to understand. I mean, anxiety herself, the whole sense of self, Joy openly admitting that maybe you don't feel as happy when you get older. What a way for make children to look forward to adulthood, right? Now, I'm not saying that these are concepts that should be ignored. Absolutely not. I'm just saying that a movie that's at least marketing itself to children and that the writers know kids will be watching just might not be the best place for it. Again, it's harder to tell than most Pixar movies because it does a better job of hiding that maturity, at least until the climax. But on the whole, it might still be just a little too adult for them. But again, it's not like that would be anything new, as Pixar's had this problem for years, which I've gone on at length about in countless other videos. So, to put it all simply, Inside Out 2 is a good movie and sequel to the original film, but not exactly the best kids movie at the end of the day. But either way, I will say that its runaway success at the box office was warranted, if only because it was much better than I, and I'm sure many others, were expecting it to be. Though at the same time, that very success does have me a bit concerned as to what it'll mean for the future of Pixar. Because as most of you probably already know, Pixar has been having some problems for a while now, both creatively and profit-wise. And it was even stated that how Inside Out 2 performed would directly influence what they would do going forward. And considering how much of a juggernaut it really was, I fear it'll only reinforce a belief a lot of people at Disney have had for a while now. That simply put, IP sells best, and that it's not worth taking risks on new stories. And the thing is, taking risks on new stories is what both Disney and Pixar were founded on. Just go read up on the production history of both Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Toy Story if you don't believe me. Neither would have ever happened if their creatives had decided to play it safe or didn't have an almost irrational belief in what they were making. And as both those movies show, it does pay off. What I'm trying to say is, considering the last two Pixar movies to hit $1 billion were Toy Story 4 and Inside Out 2, I just hope Pixar doesn't draw the wrong conclusions and won't start going all in on unwanted and unnecessary sequels to their most beloved movies. Especially because there were extenuating circumstances such as a freaking pandemic involved between those two movies. And I'm just a bit concerned that this movie's performance might only further inspire Pixar to sell their integrity and make franchises out of movies everybody knows they shouldn't. Because contrary to what many believe, sequels don't sell just because they're sequels. There has to be a reason for their existence beyond the studio wanting to make money. And the reason Inside Out 2 worked was because it not only had that, but was executed about as well as it could have ever hoped to be, because the people behind it actually wanted to make it. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's great that Inside Out 2 did as good as it did. I just hope that Pixar didn't learn the wrong lesson from its huge success. But only time will tell, I guess. Alright, I think I've gone on about all of this for long enough. So now I'd like to hear your opinions. Do you believe that Inside Out 2 was a worthy sequel to the original Inside Out movie? Or do you believe it was totally unnecessary and will only lead to the death of Pixar in the long run? Please let me know in the comments below. Just keep in mind, you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video if you don't want to. If you thought I was dead wrong about everything I said regarding Inside Out 2, that is perfectly okay, and I've got no issue with you if you do. And thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you all next time.